I want to start with a document. Section 131 of Nigeria's 1999 Constitution, now renumbered Section 137 in the amended version, sets out every qualification required to run for President of the Federal Republic. I have read it carefully. It requires Nigerian citizenship. It requires a minimum age of 40 years. It requires a school certificate or its equivalent. It does not, in any clause, in any subsection, in any schedule attached to it, contain the words federal character, geopolitical zone, or rotation. That is the document. That is what it says. Now I want to place beside it what the political conversation in this country consistently says instead: that the presidency rotates between north and south, that zoning is an established mechanism, and that certain candidacies are simply not viable, not because any written law says so, but because an unwritten political consensus has, over decades, acquired the weight of institutional fact. The Igbo are Nigeria's third largest ethnic group. They are documented engine of private sector commerce in every major Nigerian city from Kano to Lagos to Port Harcourt. They have produced governors, senators, ministers, and a central bank governor. They have not produced a president or vice president of the Federal Republic since independence in 1960. The question I am going to walk through in this video is not an emotional one. It is structural. What specific combination of constitutional design, post-war institutional settlement, and political architecture has produced a situation where the group most documented as driving Nigerian private economic activity is simultaneously the group most systematically absent from the apex of federal executive power? And is that absence written anywhere, or does it live somewhere else entirely? Before I go further, I want to be clear about how I work. Every claim you will hear in this video is traceable to a named law, a documented figure, a dated record, or a named actor's verified position. Nothing I tell you is speculation dressed as fact. If that is the standard you have been looking for, subscribe now. That is the only thing this channel promises, and it is the only promise I intend to keep.
To understand this, I need to take you back. Not to 1999 and not to 1979. I need to take you to January 1970. Because what ended in January 1970 was not just a war, it was a negotiation about what Nigeria would be. And the terms of that ending were never written into a peace treaty, a constitutional amendment, or any formal instrument of record. They were absorbed into institutional practice, and that is precisely what makes them so durable and so difficult to challenge in any court or parliament. The Biafran secession attempt of 1967 to 1970 was led overwhelmingly by Igbo military and political leadership. The federal victory under Gowon came with a public posture of reconciliation. The phrase "no victor, no vanquished" entered the national vocabulary. But when I look at what the institutional record shows in the years that followed, the posture and the practice tell different stories. Igbo civil servants who had left federal service to administer the Biafran state were not reinstated at their pre-war grades. They abandoned property policies in Rivers State, and the then southeastern state stripped returning Igbo of real property they had legally owned before 1967. The reconstruction of the southeast was measurably slower and less resourced than comparable post-conflict recovery in other regions. These are documented. They are not inferences. But the most structurally significant decision, the one whose consequences I want you to follow carefully, was made not after the war, but immediately before it. In May 1967, Gowon divided Nigeria from 4 regions into 12 states. That single act fragmented the old eastern region, which had been the political base and territorial bloc of Igbo power, into 3 separate states: East Central State, River State, and Southeastern State. The Igbo were now the majority in one of those three states, not the unifying force of a single powerful region. One majority in one state in a 12-state federation. That fragmentation was not reversed after the war. It was deepened. By 1976, further subdivision had occurred. Today, the Igbo majority states, Anambra, Imo, Enugu, Ebonyi, and Abia, are 5 of 36. The old eastern region, which would have been a political bloc comparable in weight to the Old North or the Old West, no longer exists as a negotiating unit. What replaced it is 5 states with no formal constitutional mechanism for acting at the federal level. I want you to hold that number 5 states because it is going to reappear in a form that makes everything else in this analysis legible. The second decision I want to name is the emergence of zoning as informal constitutional practice. The People's Democratic Party wrote rotational zoning into its own party constitution, specifically that the presidency should alternate between North and South. No equivalent provision exists in Nigeria's national constitution, but the PDP's internal arrangement governed the most electorally dominant party in this country for 16 consecutive years. Under that arrangement, the operative question was never which Nigerian, it was which Northerner or which Southerner, and within the South, the calculation has consistently resolved as Southwest or South-South, not Southeast. The closest parallel I have found to this in documented political history is the post-English Civil War Restoration Settlement of 1660. No law formally excluded parliamentarian families from royal favor, but the informal networks of patronage and appointment that governed access to power ensured their effective exclusion for a generation. The mechanism was not statute, it was the accumulated weight of institutional memory operating through unwritten convention. Nigeria's post-Civil War settlement operates through the same mechanism, with one critical difference. Nigeria's unwritten convention is more recent, more openly contested, and therefore, I would argue, more vulnerable to challenge than it has ever been. What I want you to carry out of this phase is a reorientation. The exclusion of Igbos from the presidency is not primarily a story about ethnic prejudice. It is a story about institutional design, specifically about what happens when the losing side of a civil conflict is never formally reintegrated into the federal power-sharing architecture.
I want to take you through 3 layers of this system, because when you see all 3 together, the question I opened with answers itself. The first layer is the legal architecture. Section 14, subsection 3 of the 1999 Constitution establishes the federal character principle, the requirement that the composition of the federal government and its agencies must reflect Nigeria's diversity so as to promote national unity. This is the constitutional foundation of the Federal Character Commission established under Section 153. When people point to federal character as the mechanism for Igbo inclusion, they are citing a real provision. But here is what I found when I read it against the documented outcomes. Federal character is a ceiling, not a floor. It governs appointments to federal agencies, parastatals, and ministries. It does not govern who get nominated for president. It does not create any affirmative mechanism for groups with documented histories of federal executive exclusion. The provision designed to ensure fairness has no operational effect on the specific question of who runs for the highest office. That gap is structural. It is not an oversight that can be fixed by better implementation. It is written into the architecture. The second layer is the Electoral Act's 25% distribution requirement. To win the Nigerian presidency, a candidate must not only win the most votes nationally, they must also win at least 25% of votes cast in no fewer than 24 of 36 states. This requirement was designed to prevent ethnic majoritarianism, to ensure that no candidate wins purely on the strength of one regional bloc's turnout. I understand the reasoning,
But here is what I want you to see when you read it against the geographic reality of Igbo settlement. A candidate whose primary support base is geographically concentrated, as Igbo electoral support has historically been, faces a structural mathematical disadvantage that a candidate with broad but shallower national support does not. The Igbo diaspora is, by every economic measure, the most nationally distributed internal migrant community in Nigeria. Igbo traders operate in all 36 states. But that commercial distribution has not translated into the kind of proportional electoral infrastructure in those states that the 25% requirement demands. The result is a threshold that costs an Igbo-identified candidacy more to clear than it costs a candidacy from a group with a more dispersed demographic and electoral footprint. The third layer is the one I think is most underreported, and it's the one that ties everything together. It is the delegate arithmetic inside the presidential primaries of the APC and the PDP. Both parties allocate delegates on a state-by-state basis. Each state produces a delegation. The size of a state's economy, its population, its commercial output, none of these factors determine its delegate weight. Its existence as a state does. 19 of Nigeria's 36 states have majority or plurality northern populations. The eastern region has 5. When a presidential primary is conducted and delegates vote, the 19 northern states consistently produce a larger collective delegation than the 5 southeast states. Now recall what I told you about the 1967 state creation exercise. The fragmentation of the eastern region into 3 states, later 5, was a wartime administrative decision. Its operational consequence in every APC and PDP presidential primary conducted in the 21st century is that Igbo political geography is still producing the outcome that 1967 structured it to produce. The war ended in 1970. The delegate math it created is still running. The significant absence I want to name is the Southeast governors themselves. In the lead-up to 2023, the election cycle in which Peter Obi mounted the most serious Igbo presidential candidacy in a generation, the 5 Southeast governors did not speak with a unified voice. Ebonyi's governor had defected to the APC, Imo's governor was APC. The Southeast's own elected leadership was divided between the 2 dominant parties. A region whose governors cannot coordinate a single negotiating position on their own group's presidential aspiration has already lost the primary negotiation before it formally begins. That absence of unity is not incidental. It is itself a product of the fragmented political geography I described. 5 separate state structures, no regional mechanism for collective federal action. There is one mechanism I have not yet fully examined, and I'm going to show you exactly what it does before this analysis is finished. It is the interaction between the delegate arithmetic and the state fragmentation, and it's what makes the problem resistant to solution at the level of individual candidacy. The 2023 election is where that becomes most visible. Every account of this subject I have read stops at the level of zoning and political will. Not one of them has gone inside the delegate arithmetic of party primaries and shown you how the 1967 state creation exercise is still determining outcomes there today. That's where I'm taking you next.
Let me show you what this system actually produces, not as a general claim about disadvantage, but as a specific traceable chain. The first consequence is institutional and self-reinforcing. Each presidential election cycle in which Igbo candidacy fails to secure a major party ticket strengthens the internal party calculation that an Igbo candidate is not viable, not because the general electorate has been tested and found unreceptive, but because the candidate never reaches the general electorate at the scale required.
Peter Obi's 2023 candidacy through the Labour Party is the exception I want you to examine carefully. He reached the general electorate. He won Lagos. He won Abuja. He satisfied the 25% threshold across the required states. He finished third in the official result. His party's legal challenges are still working through the judicial system. But what 2023 established, regardless of the litigation outcome, is that an Igbo candidate running with genuine cross-regional support still could not break through the entrenched structural advantages of APC and PDP primary mathematics. The barrier is not purely geographical. It lives inside party structures, and it predates any individual candidate who tries to challenge it. The economic consequence is documented, and I want to be specific rather than general about it. Capital investment decisions by Igbo entrepreneurs who constitute a disproportionate share of Nigeria's private sector increasingly route around the Nigerian federal state rather than through it. The phenomenon of Igbo business capital moving to Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, the United Kingdom, and Canada is not a political statement. It is a rational business response to a political economy of federal exclusion. When a community calculates correctly, based on the structural evidence I have just walked you through, that federal executive power is not accessible to them within any foreseeable political horizon, the rational response is to reduce dependence on the federal state. Nigeria is losing some of its most commercially capable human capital to jurisdictions where that capital believes it has a viable political future. That is not a sentiment. It is a documented pattern with a specific structural cause. The security consequence is the one I think is most under-discussed in serious analytical terms. IPOB, the indigenous people of Biafra, and its armed wing, the Eastern Security Network, are not best understood as a conventional ethnic nationalist movement. When I look at the conditions that produced them, what I see is the political expression of a community that has concluded, again, based on structural evidence, that the legitimate channels of federal political participation are closed to them. IPOB's sit-at-home orders have caused documented economic losses in the southeast running into hundreds of billions of naira annually. The losses fall hardest on ordinary Igbo people, the traders, the artisans, the transport workers. The irony is documented and precise. A movement that claims to fight for Igbo political liberation is inflicting its heaviest costs on the Igbo communities it claims to represent. But the deeper analytical point is this: the conditions that produced IPOB are the same conditions I have been describing throughout. A community that sees no pathway to the federal executive within a calculable political horizon has a documented tendency to produce extra systemic political actors. Nigeria saw this in the Niger Delta, where decades of resource extraction without commensurate political representation produced the armed militancy of the mid-2000s. The structural parallel is exact. Now, I want to return to the mechanism I flagged earlier, the interaction between the 1967 delegate fragmentation and the state-based primary arithmetic. Here is what it actually does, fully opened. It means the Igbo political problem cannot be solved by producing a better candidate. It requires a prior institutional solution, either a constitutional amendment changing the basis of delegate allocation, a formal zoning agreement at the level of party constitutions that explicitly names the Southeast, or the construction of a third-party structure with sufficient national reach to satisfy the 25% distribution requirement through a different coalition logic. None of those three solutions currently exist. The 2023 election showed the ceiling of the candidate-alone approach. What it did not produce, and what I do not yet see being built, is the institutional innovation the actual problem requires. The comparison that reframes the scale of this for me is in 1960, in the United States, John F. Kennedy's election as the first Catholic president was understood and has since been analyzed by political historians not primarily as the achievement of an individual, but as the resolution of a decades-long question about whether a specific community was fully incorporated into the American political compact. Nigeria has not yet had its 1960 moment for the Igbo, and the structural reasons for that absence are now, I think, fully visible. I want to ask you something directly, not as a call to react, but as a genuine question I am sitting with myself. Given the delegate arithmetic I have just walked you through, the direct mathematical inheritance of the 1967 state creation exercise, does that change how you understand whether the question of Igbo presidency is a matter of political will or a matter of structural design? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and what you tell me shapes what I analyze next.
Here is what I want you to watch between 2027, specifically 3 developments that will tell you which trajectory this is tracking. First, whether any of the 5 Southeast governors move toward a unified bloc negotiating position before the party primary season opens. A unified Southeast governor front demanding formal zoning inclusion from either major party would be qualitatively different from anything that has happened before. It has not happened in any previous election cycle. If it happens this time, it signals that the Southeast's political leadership has concluded, as I have, that the individual candidacy approach has reached its structural ceiling. Second, whether the Labour Party consolidates Peter Obi's 2023 performance into durable organizational infrastructure, specifically ward-level party registration and local government election results in Igbo majority states. The difference between a protest vote and a structural political realignment is organizational permanence between elections. I will be watching those numbers closely. Third, whether the ongoing 2023 election litigation produces any judicial ruling that sets a new evidentiary standard for challenging INEC results. The outcome of those cases does not change 2023, but the precedent they set will govern every election that follows. I opened this video with a specific question. I'm going to answer it now, with everything I have built toward that answer. The question was, what specific combination of constitutional design, post-war institutional settlement, and political architecture has produced a situation where the group most documented as driving Nigerian private economic activity is simultaneously the group most systematically absent from the apex of federal executive power? And is that absence written anywhere, or does it live somewhere else? Entirely. Here is what the evidence establishes. It is not written in the 1999 Constitution. Section 137 contains no provision barring any Nigerian from the presidency. The exclusion lives in 4 compounding structures that interact with each other in ways that none of them could produce alone. The 1967 state creation exercise fragmented Igbo political geography from a single block of regional weight into 5 smaller states with no formal mechanism for collective federal action. The 25% distribution requirement in the Electoral Act creates a geographic threshold that Igbo concentrated electoral support is structurally less suited to clearing than support from more dispersed groups. The state-based delegate avocation in APC and PDP primary rules means that 19 northern state delegations consistently outvote 5 southeast state delegations, regardless of candidate quality. And the absence of any formal zoning agreement that names the southeast means the informal north-south rotation has consistently resolved without specifying which part of the south, and has never resolved as southeast. None of these 4 structures requires ethnic malice to operate. Each has a procedural justification that has nothing to do with anti-Igbo sentiment.
But together, and this is the point I want you to take away, they constitute a system, and systems produce their outcomes regardless of the intentions of their individual components. If this configuration holds unchanged for another decade, I believe the projection is specific. Igbo economic capital will continue its documented outward migration. The security vacuum in the southeast will continue to be filled by actors like IPOB precisely because the legitimate political channels remain structurally inaccessible. And the southeast will remain what it has been since 1970. Simultaneously economically indispensable to Nigeria and politically peripheral to its federal executive. That's not a prediction based on feeling. It is the documented trajectory of the current structural arrangement extended forward. The one question I cannot yet answer, and I think you should be sitting with it too, is this. Is there a version of Nigerian federal power-sharing reform that could incorporate the Southeast into the presidential rotation without destabilizing the North-South equilibrium that has governed civilian politics since 1999? And if that version exists, who inside the current system has both the interest and the institutional leverage to initiate it? If anything I have told you contradicts what you have read or heard elsewhere, go verify it. That is not a disclaimer. That is the standard I hold this channel to. If you find an error, tell me in the comments. That is how I get better. If this analysis gave you something you didn't have before, share it with one person who is working with incomplete information on this subject. Not for the views, because accurate information is genuinely scarce in this environment, and the people who have it have a responsibility to move it. Subscribe if you want the next analysis. I'll be here.